My name's Linda Bauman. I'm president of the UNA Dane County chapter. And it's really my pleasure tonight on our educational session for this month to introduce you to Sigrun Paust. She is going to be presenting about her work on trauma, what it is and how it connects to the work and goals of the United Nations. Sigrun is a school counselor in the Madison Public Schools, and her passion is to fully understand trauma and to find ways to help survivors heal and live impactful, meaningful lives afterwards. She focuses on long-term and childhood trauma and its impact on survivors and the wider impact on communities, societies, and the world. So I would like to present now Sigrun Paust. And by the way, I have to add that she's also a board member and chair of our communications committee. Thanks.
Could I just, I'm sorry, add, I want to make sure everybody knows this session is being recorded. Okay, that's all I have to say.
All right.
Okay.
If everybody could please mute and save your questions for the end. There's a good chance I will cover what you might have questions about in between. So if you want to throw them in the chat to not forget them, that would be a great parking lot for that. I'm hoping we can see the whole screen. I had to rearrange it quickly on two computers because I couldn't see my speaker notes. All right. So let's see if this works. Okay. It's not going forward. There we go. Okay. So just a tiny bit about me. Let's see. Can you see the whole slide? Yeah. Okay. So looks good on my other Czech computer. Okay. All right. I'm not trying to have fingers on both screens here. Okay, what I'm covering today is what is trauma? And trauma isn't trauma, I'll explain. What is an ACE score? The effects of trauma, trauma and women, trauma and the work of the UN, and by extension that would mean UNA USA, generational trauma, trauma and peace, and then any questions. I have a couple of slides that if you have trauma, I want you to stay safe at all times. That is everything I try to do in my life, and especially in counseling, my work is trauma informed. And if you have trauma of your own, then a couple of these slides might trigger you. And if they have, so if you see this symbol on the top right of the slide, then, and you choose not to go there, then please feel free not to read the slide or to check out to some degree, or just keep yourself safe. So I want to start with what trauma is, definitions and distinctions. Trauma is defined in the dictionary as a deeply distressing or disturbing experience. It's also defined as an emotional response to a terrifying event during which yourself, your life, or that of a loved one was in danger of severe harm or death. I think there needs to be updated and more definitions. We will cover some of why I think that later on. Yeah, I'll get back to that point. I think these are fairly limited and they don't cover all that we nowadays think of as being trauma. So why trauma isn't trauma isn't trauma? there is a variety of different kinds of trauma. This is basically the trauma that we used to think of when we heard trauma, PTSD, certain therapies that were meant for trauma were mostly geared towards the simple trauma, as in the one-time incident that might happen to an adult. There's more ongoing trauma that got added later on, that is more kind of along the lines of combat situations. That was kind of the first of the more ongoing types of trauma that people studied and tried to figure out therapies for. Even newer on the scene is childhood trauma, even though there's nothing new about it, but it just was not for a long time considered to be a separate kind of trauma, or something that was addressed differently from the simple trauma or the ongoing adult trauma. And then there is even pre-verbal trauma, so something that happens to a child very young before they even can speak. So I'll start with the simple, and it's in quotations because there's nothing simple about trauma, and I acknowledge that. But by that I mean one event that happens one time, potentially when someone was an adult. And that can include accidents, sexual assault, or natural disaster, or other things, but those are 3 examples of what people tend to refer to when they say simple or one-time trauma. And this used to be when they said trauma. This tends to happen outside a normal that existed for the person around there. That means that the person has a normal. They have formed and built attachments, a healthy sense of self, and a support system. So there's a bad experience that invaded an otherwise normal experience of life. Then we have adult trauma. This can include more ongoing situations. So that's not a one-time, suddenly it happened and then it was over kind of event. This could be a longer experience, like combat. Combat was the first, again, of the ongoing kind of traumas that were studied. This could also be like a serious illness where you have to have treatments, you don't know the outcome, there's a lot of trauma around those kind of things. But if it happens to an adulthood, then the person had at least a chance to form a healthy self. The person might have a good support system. There's other kinds of ongoing trauma that were kind of added later to the list of things that we need to be aware of. So I split it into 2 kinds. One example of the first kind is ongoing illness. This is an ongoing, more than a one-time event. The level of trauma tends to depend on how severe the illness, what the hopes are, the chances for a good outcome, and what a person's support system is like. If the person is an adult, then they again had a chance to develop healthy coping mechanisms aside from the support system. Another kind of ongoing trauma is domestic abuse. Now we're already kind of heading into the more complex of the traumas. Domestic abuse tends to involve an erosion of social connections in order to create isolation for the victim. Domestic abuse involves an erosion of self-concept to create a perception of powerlessness of the victim. It involves threats of harm to self or loved ones, one's humanity, and potentially one's life. And it tends to involve a sense of it not ending, because there's usually Not a lot of hope for the victim that they can get out of the situation. So this definitely would fall into the more complex trauma. And then within the complex trauma area, we have childhood trauma. This can be, I hate to use the word simple. This can be more linear type of trauma, like the parents are divorcing or separating. A parent abandoned the child, but it can also be domestic abuse between the parents, which is very traumatizing to children. It affects a sense of self and safety. It is typically ongoing. The severity depends on the supportiveness of any adults around. But even if the adults around are supportive, if there's violence between them, that is very traumatizing to children. A child can likely verbalize or conceptualize what is happening depending on their age. And then we go to child abuse, neglect, and pre-verbal trauma. It typically starts before the child has any concept of self, any feelings of normal, or can verbalize any needs, feelings, or violations. It is typically all the child knows. It is most often perpetuated by the caretakers, which is a fundamental betrayal of basic trust and sense of self, because the caretakers are supposed to be the ones that love and protect the child, as opposed to being the perpetrators of the abuse or the neglect. Yeah, I cannot emphasize that enough. A betrayal by the caretakers, who are supposed to be the lovers and protectors, just destroys a child's fundamental sense of safety and self. And I will talk a little bit more about the effects in a minute. Another ongoing trauma situation is being trafficked. Where does it fit in on the trauma spectrum? It depends a little bit. 79% of trafficking in persons is for sexual exploitation. This comes from the UN data. 70 to 80% of sexually trafficked persons are women and girls. Numbers vary slightly by data source, but they're about in that range usually. Victims are often very young and still developing. Over 50% of sex trafficked persons are minors. That means they're under 18. Victims are often trafficked long-term. Victims are often threatened and abused in other ways. Victims are separated from caring adults, not helped by the caring adults, or were even sold by them. Victims are usually dehumanized in every way that keeps them compliant and from escaping. And because of that, they often don't see or have a way out. They expect to not ever escape or not potentially survive the experience. This information is from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime report on human trafficking. One way that we have started to measure trauma is via an ACE score. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. An ACE score is a measure of the number of different kinds of adverse childhood experiences a person has had. So it deals with childhood trauma. It does not deal with the other kinds that I mentioned before. I mentioned childhood trauma. The concept and assessment of the score came actually from an obesity study in California in the 1980s. During the obesity study, researchers realized that they had a very high dropout rate. And then they realized that those who dropped out were actually the participants that were successful in losing weight. So they did some more digging into why the ones who were successful at losing weight dropped out. And they realized that with the weight loss, people were losing a protective mechanism that they had built up to cope with some trauma. And that's how the ACE study began, or morphed into like a trauma study. Questions they would ask to arrive at an ACE score for a person would include, before you were 18, did people in your family hurt or threaten you or another family member? Put you down, ridicule you, or threaten you? Separate, leave the family, or abandon you? Touch you in a sexual way? Not love you in your own perception? Not provide for your basic needs? That includes food and shelter and safety. Have mental illness, commit suicide, or go to prison. That's data from the CDC that supported and took over the study. I will share all my links later that I have embedded here. I just wanted you to see where all this information comes from. So the biggest insights gained from the ACE study were these two. ACE scores were incredibly common. 2/3 of study participants had experienced at least one ACE. 1 in 8 individuals had experienced 4 or more. So 4 is a significant history of trauma. The higher your ACE score, the higher the likelihood of developing long-term health problems like heart disease, stroke, cancer, and diabetes. The study did not account for stressors outside of the household, protective factors, or individual differences. So it indicates correlation between trauma and health later in life. It does not necessarily indicate causation. But what does that tell us about trauma? It was a very pivotal study for the research on trauma. First of all, it told us that many people experience trauma during childhood and many experience a high amount of it, a score above 4 on the ACE scale. It showed that trauma and traumatic stress start mentally and then become physical because it caused illness later in life, physical illness like heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. Traumatic stress affects people many years after it was experienced. These adverse health effects did not usually happen until decades later. So basically, for the first time, showed a correlation between childhood trauma and later health effects, the physical health effects. And as a conclusion, people realized that more needs to be done to support survivors and to help them heal so that these adverse health effects can be minimized or avoided. So what are the effects of trauma? We can talk about effects, and we can talk about symptoms, and we can talk about coping. And those are really different words for the same idea. I prefer to talk about effects. The effects of trauma are both mental, emotional, and physical. The effects have traditionally been conceptualized and measured as a set of symptoms of a disorder called PTSD, and much more recently, they added CPTSD, which stands for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a collection of symptoms that indicate a person has experienced trauma and is still feeling the after effects at the current time. The official symptoms of the trauma of the PTSD include 3 groups of symptoms. Intrusive symptoms, which are memories, dreams, as in nightmares, re-experiencing emotions of the trauma. There's avoidance, avoiding situations, people, or reminders of the trauma. Negative patterns of thought or mood. Those tend to include being easily startled, chronically frightened, or hypervigilant. Disturbed concentration and sleep. Aggression, and or depression. Much later, this happened, I would say in the last 10 years, that CPTSD was added, complex PTSD. It was realized that PTSD alone did not sufficiently even describe the effects of complex trauma. So it shares most of its symptoms with PTSD and has a similar cause, but there were several distinctions that were found between the two. While PTSD can develop at any age, it's usually the result of single occurrence or adult trauma, whereas CPTSD is typically the result of childhood trauma. Since the trauma was earlier, more ongoing, and more complex, so are the effects of it. Additional symptoms of CPTSD include ongoing negative or incomplete self-image. This means that a person might not know themselves accurately. They might in some aspects of their life, but not in others. They might know that, for example, they have a talent for music or art or sports or are intelligent, but they might not have an accurate self-concept when it comes to emotions, relationships, values, or even likes and dislikes. There might be ongoing difficulties with relationships. The effects can also often be seen in social interactions outside even of relationships, but they are most certainly seen in relationships, whether it's forming them or maintaining them or having healthy ones. The effects usually show up there. Mental and emotional detachment or hyper-attachment. So sometimes instead of feeling detached, a person with CPTSD can feel overly attached to people, can feel overly attached to animals or even things that even people with simple trauma might find unusual. So I'm thinking of, the shows we see on TV about hoarding. My suspicion is that there's a lot of complex trauma there, because there's this to many people irrational attachment to things. And it can lead to a loss of malformation of systems of meaning or a system of meaning. That does not necessarily mean there's a complete absence of systems of meaning. There might be a partial system, like there is a partial self-concept. So in some areas, people might have meaning, and in some areas of their lives, they might not. This information is from the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used for psychological and psychiatric diagnosis and treatment. So as we talked about earlier, childhood trauma and pre-verbal trauma has and leads to additional complications over other trauma. Cumulative childhood trauma was more strongly associated with CPTSD. So children who had trauma for an ongoing period of time and or had multiple ACEs had a better chance of ending up with the effects of CPTSD. This happens because as a child grows, develops, and matures, they build a sense of self, which is disrupted in this case, interpersonal trust, which is disrupted in this case, a system of meaning, which gets disrupted, mental and emotional regulation and balance, which typically are very disrupted, independence, which does not necessarily develop healthily, the ability to initiate and maintain healthy relationships. Because childhood trauma disrupted the healthy development, the trauma has greater effects on the typical human capabilities and developments, and therefore has a broader and deeper impact on the person and their personality. So back to the wording of effects, symptoms, and coping. CPTSD and PTSD, are they a disorder? What is the definition of a disorder? It's a state of confusion, a disruption of systematic functioning, or a neat arrangement of something or someone. So if we're just talking the disruption of systematic functioning, I can buy into the disorder wording, I guess, is like, yeah, the word disorder. I'm gonna strongly do my best in my career to advocate for that to be changed to maybe syndrome or something, because a disorder carries a connotation of something being wrong with the person or something being maladaptive. And while the effects of trauma later in life can be maladaptive, the person's reaction to the trauma at the time was adaptive. And the ongoing trauma abuse warranted that the person find coping mechanisms in order to preserve their life, any sort of sense of safety and sanity. And so therefore, to consider these maladaptive, that's a passion of mine to not have that remain the definition that we have. So I think it's better to conceptualize it as a syndrome, because maladaptive versus adaptive is just a matter of perspective and time. I have a couple of examples for that. The effects of trauma start as a protective mechanism of the brain attempting to minimize harm to the person during the trauma, to preserve sanity and to ensure survival. For example, dissociation. Dissociation is basically when someone mentally separates from the reality or the moment. And while this can seem maladaptive to us later in life, if the person as a child endured ongoing trauma or saw something really gruesome, then to dissociate was a protective state of their mind that prevented them from experiencing or remembering the incident more vividly than they already do. And in that sense, it served as a preservation of sanity. Numbing is another common coping mechanism. Numbing, if a person experiences ongoing abuse, then numbing prevents an overly emotional reaction that could endanger the person more. It could cause them more psychological or physical harm, and certainly more suffering. So in that sense, it served as a coping mechanism to increase survival and potentially lead to escape, because it preserved thinking. So those two are symptoms of PTSD and CPTSD, of a disorder. And to me, they are effects of the very strong survival instinct that most of us have, that the child innately was wise enough to utilize during their trauma and has to find a way to unlearn. But to me, again, they're not maladaptions or symptoms, they are coping mechanisms. Okay, so this is a slide that I would like you to read on your own silently. Notice that it has the stay safe symbol on the top of the page. So if you have childhood trauma, you may or may not want to read this. You may want to cover your camera if you think you might have a hard time reading it. And I will give you a couple minutes to read through this if you choose to. Okay, now we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about how all this trauma information relates to the UN and its work and our work. First off, trauma disproportionately affects women via incidence of trauma. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men have been injured by an intimate partner. 1 in 10 women have been raped by an intimate partner. Data is unavailable for male victims. 1 in 7 women and 1 in 18 men have been stalked, including severe believable threats of harm by an intimate partner. Women between the ages of 18 to 24 most commonly as the age group that experiences domestic abuse. Of the women who reported being sexually assaulted in their lifetimes, and sexual assault is defined as attempted or completed rape, 21.6% were younger than 12, and 32.4% were ages 12 to 17. So that means over 50% were minors. 64% of women who were sexually or physically assaulted experienced this violence by an intimate or domestic partner. This data is from the US Department of Justice. 92% of perpetrators of domestic violence are male. 82% of victims are female. Trauma disproportionately affects women via the effects of trauma. One of the signs or requirements for mental well-being is environmental mastery, which is the ability to assert individual preferences in complex social environments, is a crucial factor of psychological well-being. ongoing childhood trauma, domestic abuse, as well as being trafficked, all severely disrupt this environmental mastery, thus leading to significant impacts on the psychological well-being of the victims. Trauma and its effects are both more frequent and more severe for people who have previously been victimized and affected. So, you know, the reasons are a whole presentation and they're on their own, but if a child experienced childhood trauma, they're more likely to end up in a relationship where they might experience more trauma. And that trauma's impact will also then be more severe than if that was the first trauma. So the cumulative effects are stronger and also more likely to cause further trauma. Women are also disproportionately affected by violence that surround conflicts, natural disasters, famine, pandemics, and non-voluntary migration. So that leads us to the UN work and trauma. Why would understanding trauma be important in connection to working with the UN and UNA-USA? Again, women are disproportionately impacted and affected by trauma surrounding conflict, natural disaster, famine, migration, and disease. This includes women and by extension, their children. Women are the guardians of family, community, and the future. This was basically a decision or like a conclusion that came out of the Microloans for Women program that ended up giving, and I can't remember his name, but the man got the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Because he realized that when you invest in women, when you give women financial opportunity, they invested in family, community, and the future. In contrast to when people give financial opportunity to men who invested it in the current time frame and in themselves. Gender equality is an important effort of the UN because the UN realizes that lifting up women and girls will further many of the SDGs as well as further peace. This is a statement by the UN. When we lift up women, we lift up children and families. Again, because women tend to invest their opportunities into their families and children. By extension, they invested into their children's education. So we are lifting up education. When we lift up women, we tend to lift up sanitation because as part of their investment into their families and children, women tend to want to improve sanitation. Women tend to invest and create better opportunities for healthcare for themselves, and then by extension for other women and families. Women tend to invest opportunity into future opportunity that reduces their struggle, including for food and livelihood. And by extension, women tend to further sustainability because women are more family and future oriented in their investments. They consider and further sustainability efforts because they consider what would be best for their children. Nobody is saying that men don't also do this, but many programs and studies have found that women tend to do this to a much larger extent. So when we lift up women, we lift up everyone. Which leads me to CEDAW. The full report of the prevalence, incidence, and consequences of violence against women concluded that violence against women, particularly intimate partner violence, should be classified as a major public health and criminal justice concern in the United States. This is a statement by UN Women. UN Women is therefore focusing on and measuring, collecting data on financing women's organizations, financing and mainstreaming peace and security agendas specifically for women, increasing women's leadership and political participation and general gender parity, and devising and implementing national strategies for advancing women's peace and security. These statements were made by UN Women at the link that I'm providing. There's one kind of trauma that I have not covered yet, and that is generational trauma. Just like we have generational poverty, we have generational trauma. And that's because traumatized people traumatize people. This is a general description of a family circumstance of how trauma becomes generational. Again, it has the symbol at the top right. So if you get triggered by mentioning of personal trauma and long-term childhood trauma and generational trauma, please keep yourself safe. This might strike you both as an oversimplification and also as too many things thrown in one pot, but I can assure you that these kinds of situations and families are plentiful. Just working in Madison schools and just knowing people from the Palestinian community, you see it everywhere. Which translates over to trauma and peace. Peace was an effort mentioned by the UN as one of the ways to uplift women and combat trauma. And I think they understand that happy, healthy, and prosperous people don't tend to start wars. There's a study currently in the, it's an article by Frontiers in Psychiatry, where they looked at trauma and conflict in Africa. And their statement was that chronic warfare as a lived experience creates significant social and psychological distress in a population. Trauma causes not only significant psychosocial problems, but also immediately well-defined psychiatric symptoms such as PTSD, anxiety, and depression. The effects of trauma cause morbidity and retard development in communities and socioeconomic development with transgenerational perpetuation. So generational trauma leads to generational conflict, which leads to generational regression in prosperity, health, happiness, and safety. So what do we do about it? Healing trauma. Like I said at the beginning, a talk on strategies to heal trauma would be another entire talk. Could be a very long talk, could be several talks. What connects it to our focus today in the work with the UN is that there are certain proactive, positive things that can be done that will reduce the impact of trauma, aside from any sort of healing therapies and strategies. So studies found that individuals are more likely to overcome even complex trauma if they possess or are instilled with certain growth factors. These growth factors are things that can potentially be taught and improved for people. So there's a starting point of reducing trauma. These traits, attitudes, and actions have been found to increase post-traumatic growth and reduce post-traumatic stress. Actually, just simply a higher activity level, right? Not sitting at home, but doing stuff, which in school these days, we call that an action mindset, right? The idea that if I take any sort of action, it's better than not taking any action. Seeking social support and networks has been shown to be a growth factor. Awareness of one's own strengths and strength, so both, right? Realizing how strong someone is, how strong you are, and realizing what strengths you have were both growth factors. Increased compassion. There's a I'm not aware of one particular study, but there is research that shows that it's very healing for people who are survivors of trauma to help others, particularly with their trauma and with their healing. Adjustment of meaning. So if you are able to examine your systems of meaning and where they might be broken and adjust, you have a better chance of growth rather than stress and symptoms. Trying new possibilities and paths. So staying open and pivoting and trying new things, rather than deciding that, you're going to stick with what you know, and maybe even if it's not working. And feeling interconnected with other survivors. Those things have been known to be buffers and growth factors for survivors. This might seem like a simple question. Can we heal trauma? It's not as simple as it sounds. I had actually two poignant discussions with the same psychiatrist who was a professor at UW-Madison. My first discussion with him was during my master's program. My second was years after, when I was in a training that he was running. And I basically asked him this question: can we heal trauma? Can we heal complex trauma? Was pretty much more likely the question. And he was a very established psychiatrist. He was not terribly old. He was probably middle-aged. And so not super old school in that sense, I figured. And his response was very discouraging. He basically said, yeah, good luck with that. That doesn't happen. And just like I refused to believe my grad school professor when he said that depression is entirely biochemical and is entirely nature caused, and I know better. I know it's nurture influenced to a large degree. I know that it's one of the symptoms of PTSD, for example. I also disagreed with the psychiatrist immediately, and I said I refuse to believe that. We have two ways to go about healing trauma. Healing the individual to break the cycle, for one person, one family, and maybe even a community. That's where a lot of research is being done, and that will be the topic of another talk. There's so much that there was nothing, I want to say, 20 years ago. And then oh, what's the book with the tiger by Peter Levine? Tiger, something tiger. That was like the very first inkling of, someone like, wow, there's something we might be able to do, he wrote this book, Peter Levine. And since then, lots of stuff, especially in the last 5 years, lots of stuff has come out. Lots of awareness of CPTSD and complex trauma and childhood trauma and how they're different. And there's hope that we will find yes, we can heal it, and this is how. Many things to look at and, synchronize and come back with another talk. This is sort of what I think where the UN is heading and focusing, healing the collective. The efforts of the UN, nations, and communities have to come together to break the collective trauma cycle and further the SDGs. This is the work that is in front of us. This is how trauma is connected to the UN. And this is, if you look at pretty much any given SDG, it has to do with healing collective trauma. And that is what I have.
Thank you so much, Sigrun, for a very thorough presentation on this subject. And
Yeah, you're welcome. It's
I
my
will
passion.
open. Well, it shows. I'll open it up for questions. I always have questions, but I'll let other people have an opportunity.
Waking the Tiger, thank you. Yes, Waking the Tiger, Healing Trauma by Peter Levine. That was the book. That was the first one that I remember coming across that actually addressed complex trauma.
So if I don't see any other hand up.
There's Aaron and there's Louise.
Okay, we'll do that in that order. Aaron, Louise, and then myself.
Actually, Louise had her hand up before I did.
Okay, Louise, Aaron, and then me.
Thank you. Can we assume that all the Afghan refugees that are arriving in our state now are suffering some form of PTSD?
Yes, I think that would be safe to assume, even if they were translators and not involved. It was a war. Afghanistan was a war zone, and it was a war zone before our involvement, and it was a war zone before the Russian involvement, the Soviet involvement. So I would say safely that there's lots of complex generational trauma there.
So my was more a comment, but I would like you to weigh in on it, Sigrun. The very last point you made, I think, was really important and could be talked about a lot. Looking at right now, I don't think we think about the environmental, literally climate change and the impact that it has on trauma and that it will continue to have on trauma. That are traumatizing people, traumatizing entire nations, and the fact that as water disappears, as land disappears, people will be traumatized, and then they will be fighting each other and going to war in order to get land and water. Something that I'm very familiar with as our youth seeker is that when there is war, there is almost always a lot of sexual violence. Sexual assault is one of the most common weapons of war. And I'm just, wondering if you have anything else to say about that, Sigrun, or what you think, or what your studies have shown regarding the climate change and trauma.
Yeah, there was a reason why I had several slides on trauma and women, because they are disproportionately affected by it. and impacted. So both in numbers and in severity and in type of trauma and in complexity of trauma, disproportionately affects women. Intimidation of civilians, I think, is one of the main war strategies outside of straight up combat. And it tends to be directed at women because they are easier targets, let's say it like that. And they tend to stick around to protect their children. They won't just, up and run.
Yes.
Which is involved in a lot of domestic abuse too. She sticks around because of the children. It's so there was a reason why I had several slides on that, and I really wanted to pull good numbers that showed the increased impact on women. With the sustainability, yes, I mean, I'm including COVID, I'm including pandemics in that. They are caused, I think, in part, and they will increase with climate change. And we see what it did to women. We see how much trauma it caused. We had a discussion today at school. Basically, the administration acknowledging that, the children for sure are traumatized. They've been sitting at home for a year and a half. Many did not have great home situations. And then they looked around and they said, heck, the staff is traumatized. We're traumatized. Adults are traumatized because we had to deal with all this. This was all new. This was all scary. So I'm really hopeful to see that the middle schoolers that I work with are super into preventing as much climate change as they can. They're super enthusiastic about it, which gives me hope. But yeah, that's both kind of that climate change is a causation of trauma and vice versa, and yeah, it'll lead to, I think that slide on Africa showed that it shortage of resources and shortage of opportunity leads to perpetual conflict, and that leads to perpetual trauma.
Thank you, Sigrun. My comment also relates a bit to the Afghani refugees that have come to the US. And we know just from their circumstances that they've experienced a lot of trauma recently, and just living in a war zone for so long. Are there any efforts to address it in some kind of preventive way? Any systematic assistance that refugees are provided beyond clothing and food and shelter? Even though those are pretty important.
Yeah. And that's being addressed, right? I think we have to look at the Hmong population and learn what not to repeat, right? They were the Afghans from, God, it's been 50 years ago, right? But we brought them here, we got them out, we saved them as we thought, and then we, proceeded to treat them as intruders and immigrants and less than and minorities and not fully acceptable. And there's still a lot of trauma in the Hmong population. So I think, and that's a political thing too. I think let's not repeat that. Let's learn from it. Let's do better. Whether that will happen widespread is the other question, right? I know that people like us are eager and willing to do that. I do my part in and I've worked a lot with Palestinian refugees who are perpetual refugees. So I do my part, and we do our part in schools by being welcoming, accepting, accommodating. I tend to pretty quickly, once I'm at a new school, start a group for Muslim youth, because they have nowhere else to pretty much gather with their own and be together, and hoping to get some Afghan kids in there if we get any. So I think we have one family as of right now that is coming. I don't know if they've started yet. I think they might start next week. But that's a complex question because you know, those of us who are willing to look back and learn and do better are probably doing it. It's how we get the rest of the people to do it. That's the question.
Thank you.
Louise?
Can I ask a second question?
Yes.
Totally
yes.
different, totally different. When you were talking about trafficking, human trafficking, it occurred to me that all the ones that want to be trafficked or they want to traffic are usually young and attractive women. Do women age out of that? And if so, what happens to them?
I don't have any particular data. As far as I know, like big picture, many, first of all, don't survive it. There's other abuse and they tend to fall victim to that, or they get diseases. There's not care for them, right? Or, you know, some of them get intentionally addicted to drugs. They might not survive that. Yes and no. I think it depends on the parts of the world, right? There's information from red light districts in India where the women technically don't really age out, and maybe they do once their daughters can take over, and that's the saddest part, right? They groom their daughters to take over, and that was covered in the documentary. How with the cameras? What was it? That won a I don't know if it won an Oscar, but it won a big prize. It was a documentary of a group that went into the red light district in India and taught the kids, gave the kids cameras and taught them to take pictures and tried to pay for their education so they wouldn't, you know, follow their mom's footsteps. And out of that came the whole Women Carry Half the Sky movement, which, you know, does a lot of support for rescued. Rescue is probably the biggest opportunity to age out, so to speak, is that you get rescued or you get away somehow. Doesn't happen for a lot of the victims. So, you know, in Eastern Europe, that might be different. They might have, if the traffickers think they have enough resource of younger, prettier women, they might age older women out. I don't know, right? And I think it depends on the place too. From what I understand in Europe, it's more that the teen girls, yeah, you know, and they might get tossed aside when they're not young and pretty anymore. But, you know, places like India, I think they just kind of stay in that system until they get too sick or too old or whatever, you know. But truly getting out, I don't know, unless you get rescued, it's not really, I think, a hugely statistically significant outcome, unfortunately.
I'd like to add something to that, Louise, that I'm familiar with trafficking in nursing. And many developing countries have women that get trained. They get registered nurse degrees or nursing assistant certification, and they're recruited to come to the US and for a job. And when they get here, they find that their passports are withheld from them and they're essentially indentured servants, and they're made to work with little pay, no freedom to do anything. And that's not a younger age group that they're targeting.
So tragic.
Yeah, I actually knew a woman who came, was brought as a nursing assistant from Southeast Asia to work with this handicapped man. I worked in the public housing where I worked, and she ended up being basically pressured to marry him by him, you know, to become his wife and caretaker so she would do it for free. And she had no resources to get out of it, which was hugely tragic, I thought. Right.
Yeah, I could, you know, add, I mean, that the people with disabilities are highly targeted for sexual assault and trafficking. About 50% of all people with hearing loss or hearing impairment or deaf people are sexually assaulted. And I've worked with older victims before who have remained prostituted. They just sometimes they're experience is sought out by people because they are not so young, but they have years of experience. And so that is, keeps them in that field. But the more vulnerable somebody is, the more they are targeted for sexual violence. I could say that about sexual violence in general.
Are there other questions or comments for Sigrun?
Very interesting talk. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Very important topic.
Well, thank you so much for a really enlightening presentation, very thoroughly covered, and definitely an issue for the UN worldwide. And I appreciate you presenting and being part of our board, Sigrun.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So thank you all. And our next presentation, we don't know what that's yet. April will let us know for our December program, and our November program is going to be our UNA Day celebration on November 14th, which is a Sunday, and I hope to see you all there via Zoom, and it should be a very exciting presentation that very much ties into this topic with Bandana Rana presenting as the vice chair of the UN Commission on the I always trying to remember what CETA stands for, the Committee
Comments.
on the
I have it on the slide.
Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
And all
this is a
forms
big-
of discrimination, yeah.
Okay, so thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you so
all.
much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.